And also, I want to tell all of you, if you want to, it used to not automatically have all your names, but if you want to remove your name or change your name, you can. Oh, they just went away. No, I don't know. They go away sometimes. Anyway, if you want to change yours or take it off, you go ahead if you want. Um, so what you'll need, we need the observation worksheet for Ezekiel 16. We'll do some observation at some point. So you want those things handy that you use for that. And you will want your lesson 5 homework out. And we'll be working with back and forth as we started last week with those things. So as you guys get that stuff out, last week we got through verses 1 to 7 of the chapter. And so when you all have Ezekiel 16 opened up there, we'll just do a quick review of those first verses, and we can kind of start the way we normally would with who is speaking. If we start with our who's.
The Lord speaking through Ezekiel.
Yeah, good. And who's he speaking to through Ezekiel?
The Israelites, the
Okay.
exiles.
Is he speaking to the exiles?
Oh no, make known to Jerusalem.
Yeah. So it in a way it doesn't matter because he's saying make known to Jerusalem. But as we watch this subject progress, is he talking to and about the whole nation of Israel?
Yes.
Yes, because immediately he starts to talk to them about the topic that he talks about is what?
How the nation of Israel came into existence.
Okay, so their
So from the
origin
beginning.
or their birth. And so we see that immediately he's talking about the whole nation to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And we'll talk about why as we go through things and how it connects to everything else that we've seen. So when we looked at that, then what did we learn about that, about their origin or their beginning? What did we learn right here in Ezekiel?
Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite.
Yes. And what other land was mentioned?
Canaan.
Land of Canaan.
Okay.
Canaan.
So we saw that they have a specific geographical location that we'll talk more about in a second, that we looked up how to find out more about that. And then what else did we learn? So we saw where they came from. And then what was the rest of the focus of those first 7 verses?
That nobody cared about them.
Yeah, they were abandoned. It was like an abandoned baby, right? An abandoned baby left to die. And by the time we get to the last couple verses, they do have a protector, right? Somebody comes and what I can think of as rescuing them, right? And who was that?
God.
God, right? What's the picture he said there? What did he do when he saw them initially? It says saw them. Remember, it's an allegory, so of course God knows they were there, but it's a picture that we're looking at.
He told them to live.
He said live, right? You have been left here to die, but I want you to live. And then, in fact, he said, what did he do for them? Did they live?
Yeah.
Yeah, how did they progress according to verse 7?
God made them numerous like plants of the field and
Okay.
grew up and
Yep.
everything was formed. I won't go in the details, but
they have
matured.
They matured. They have reached the age of what would have been considered feminine maturity in that culture at that age. So, but they became numerous and they grew, they blossomed, right? Maybe we could just use the word blossomed. They blossomed.
Perfect.
Because God had them do that. And then what we did after that is, because we learned that this is an allegory, this is God using a picture to give a message to the people of Israel. Now, this is a way that we can look at how does this relate to chapter 15? What was he doing in chapter 15? What was that about? If you were listening to my prayer, you'll be able to remember.
Oh, divine.
The vine, that his people were a vine. And then if they weren't fruitful, they were going to be burned. So he had just used a picture of a vine, and now he's using another picture. It's very much, to me, the way Jesus taught with the parables, right? If you look, and sometimes you'll open a chapter of Matthew, Mark, or Luke, not as much as John, but you'll see, oh, there's this parable. What's it about? Then you have to back up like 20 chapters because it's parable after parable after parable, but it's all about one idea. And he just gives different examples to try to make sure everybody understands. And I feel like this is a similar idea here, God using another allegory. Plus, this one gives us a whole nother picture. We learned one problem with them by looking at them as this vine, and now we see another issue in a very specific manner. So since we know verses 1 through 7 represent a true picture of his people, we looked then at, together, we looked at Genesis 12, 13, and 15, all in one question, which was number 3A on page 55. And that's why we went there, right? To see how this lines up with the actual historical account. And what did we learn when we looked at those places in Genesis?
That God would make them a great nation and that they would be blessed.
Okay, how did that start? Who did that start with?
Abram.
Abraham.
Abraham, right? Abraham, who became Abraham. And how did God get Abraham? Like, how did that happen?
He sends him out to a new land and promises what Sarah said, to make him a great nation and to bless him. And then he promises him a son. He makes a covenant with him.
Okay, so we see that the beginning of this was God calling an individual to set out. Do we have that land named in the cross references that we looked at?
Yes.
What's it
Canaan.
named?
Canaan.
And so we see that that's this same beginning that God's speaking about in Ezekiel 16. Okay, so he promised him that land, and he promised him descendants and a lot of other things that you guys mentioned, that he would make them great, he would bless them. That's where we have the verses about those who bless Israel will be blessed, those who curse Israel will be cursed, and in all nations of the world you will be a blessing. So that's what we saw, but it related to here with their beginning was in Canaan. So we saw that. Okay, are we good up through there? That was pretty much what we handled. I don't remember how much we actually looked at verse 8, but we're going to go ahead and go to verse 8. You should have it observed because you finished observation for a couple sections at home. But would, if I just go in order, Pat, could you read Ezekiel 16:8 for us, just the one verse?
Verse 8. Then I passed by you and saw you, and behold, you were at the time for love. So I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. I also swore to you and entered into a covenant with you so that you became mine, declares the Lord God.
Okay, so we want to spend a minute on this verse so that we make sure we get this part right, because the language, some of it's a little unusual for us. So if we just look at the first line of the verse, and we look at time references, so what has happened as Israel has blossomed? Now God looks at them again And what does he notice now?
Now they're at a time for love.
Right. So that blossoming that we talked about, they are fully ready for adult marital relationship, right? That's what he's saying. You were at the time for love.
Right.
Okay. Let's skip over the next part for just a minute. Just skip over that little segment, okay? Because this is what you can do. I know a lot of you actually already know this because you've done the covenant study. So you probably already a lot of you already have a pretty good handle on this, but let's just pretend we don't. What's the next thing he says after you get past the nakedness part?
I swore to you,
Okay. And
entered
swore
into a
means promised, right? I swore to you, I made an oath and entered into a
covenant.
covenant with you.
Then
Okay. Then before we even try to figure out what that means, God tells us part of what
Yeah.
it means next. What's involved in this covenant?
he cleans them and bathes
Before
them.
that, right?
Oh,
Still
before
in
that.
verse 8. Still in verse 8.
Oh,
You became mine.
Okay. So even if you skip that one little section and you haven't ever studied covenant and you think that's kind of
Oh, yeah.
weird at the time for love, what's this a picture of to you?
Marriage.
Marriage, right?
With his
It
bride,
seems
yeah.
pretty clear, or at least the idea of a love relationship, right? This is a picture of God making Israel his bride, right? And you
Right.
can see that I am making you mine. I'm making you mine, and you are at the time for love. So let's clarify that though. And oh, I don't think I ever added this verse. I have it in front of me, but would someone or all of you or would somebody look up Ezekiel 16:8 in the NLT?
The NLT. Okay.
Because again, sometimes looking at other translations will help you before you even try going to concordance or any of those other things.
I've got it.
Okay, would you read it, Sarah?
And when I passed by again, I saw that you were old enough for love. So I wrapped my cloak around you to cover your nakedness and declared my marriage vows. I made a covenant with you, says the sovereign Lord, and you became mine.
Okay, so that version makes it clear. And we do have one other, a really specific picture of this. A lot of you know where this is as well, because a lot of you all did the Kinsman Redeemer study as well. So I have a group in front of me that are all caught up in their covenant and Kinsman Redeemer studies. So not a mystery to those of you, but let's go to Ruth 3:9 so that people can see this. And it's just as confusing when you see it in Ruth until you study the cultural context and God's language that he uses. So if somebody would read Ruth 3:9 when they get there.
I've got it.
Okay, Mary.
Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are a kinsman redeemer.
Okay, this is the same language and the same thing happening. This is Boaz, and this is
Sure.
Ruth offering to be his bride, and he accepts. Of course, you know the whole story. He's a man of honor, so someone else is entitled first. He has to go ask him. Anyway, my danger here this week is that's very difficult not for me to like talk about covenant and kinsman redeemer like for a long time on here. But we're not doing either one of those studies at the moment. I will say if you're watching online or if you're in this class and you have never done the covenant study or the kinsman redeemer study, I highly recommend them both. They are both together faith changing, foundation changing, life changing. And I
Absolutely.
think I would see a bunch of nodding here as well. Favorites of a lot of people. So does everybody get that picture, right?
Yes.
That corner of the garment, if you look, there's other places in Psalms where it talks about the corner of God's wings and his wing he puts over them. Same picture. It's this protective cover and offer of protection in marriage. So that's now what God has done in verse 8 for his people. Okay? All right. So you looked at that at home on your own, and then you continued through 9 through 14. So your observation is done. Oh, before that, we'll go to the covenant. I keep forgetting. I would be like approaching this differently, but because I think it's easiest for you, I'm trying to go through your homework in order, but I'm forgetting. So you had some cross references, not talking about what covenant is, but looking at this covenant that we know God made with his people, and we just want to see that covenant and what happened with it. So you are now down to letter B on page 55. Again, we're not going to read the references. We'll just talk about what you found in your notes about them. Okay, so this is looking at what else, or the extension of, I guess, the covenant. Okay, so the first one you looked at was Genesis 17, 15 to 21. Is there somebody who'd like to just tell us? And the best thing to do with these is just grab whatever really connects to what you are going to learn from the chapter you're in, which is Ezekiel 16. Okay, what did we learn about this covenant in Genesis 17?
That God would bless Ishmael, but his covenant would be made with Isaac, and whom Sarah will bear to you this season next year.
Okay. And what's he going to do with Isaac? What's God going to do?
Everlasting covenant.
He's going to establish his everlasting covenant with Isaac and
His descendants.
his descendants after him. Okay. And that's essentially what you want to know. It's good to have that information as well, that it's Isaac from Abraham and from Sarah's body. There's a lineage that's important to God, and he always makes it clear. Okay, any questions? That's really what we needed there from there. So we've already talked about the fact that there is a promise of land to Abraham and descendants, and you see him mentioning the descendants here. We'll keep watching for the two things together. Okay, then you went to Genesis 35, 9 to 12. Now who is involved and what do we learn?
Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob. Who is Jacob? Anybody want to tell us? Like connected to Abraham and Isaac?
Isaac's son.
Isaac's son. So now we're in the third generation. And what do we learn in Genesis 35?
God blessed, appeared to Jacob and blessed him as Israel.
Okay, changed his name to Israel. Yep.
Stated, he was God Almighty, and you'll be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you,
Okay.
and king.
Yes.
And the land God gave to Abraham and Isaac gives to Israel.
And the land. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So God reconfirmed these covenants. If you were in both these stories with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you would see that each Isaac and Jacob had a relational thing that happened with God. And then at those moments, God confirmed that covenant that he'd already made. He didn't change it. He hadn't taken it away. He just confirms it with them as they step into their next part of life. Okay, so good. We just see God, your homework called it extending, right? We see how far this covenant was going to go. Okay, definitely the next part, I would have done it a bit of a different order, but we're going to stick with the order in your homework. We're still just looking at references that help us understand verses 1 to 7. Like, what's this origin story about? So the first, you had a set of 4 verses under number 4 on page 56. Okay, so we're going to look at those. Same thing, just tell us what you learned about the forming of the nation. The first place that you went was Deuteronomy 12, 10, and 11.
But God's going to give them the land that's of their enemies so they can live in security, and he will choose the place for his name.
Okay, he will choose it when you get there, right? When you cross the Jordan. When you cross the Jordan, is this the first time these people have been to this land? Deuteronomy comes after Numbers, which comes after Exodus.
Exodus. Oh no,
So no, it's not. Again, so I would have done the next section of verses first and then done these, but we're going to stick here because I see why they did it. So think about that. This promise right here, when you cross the Jordan, they're going back to the land, right? They're going back to the land. But he says again, one more time about what's his relationship going to be to the place. Dee Dee said it. I just want us to say it one more time since I jumped in there.
that he's going to choose where the place for his name. So
Yeah.
where his temple is.
For his name to dwell, right? His name to dwell. He will choose it in that place. So he hasn't told them yet what exact place in that land it's going to be, but we're going to watch him do that. Okay. Anybody else or questions or anything on Deuteronomy?
There's a vow to the Lord at the end of that as well, and which it's almost like, to me, that reminds me back about the marriage
Yes.
vow.
Yes.
You know.
And again, they had already done that, and we'll see it in backwards order. Yes. So they're continued that these things that they're going to do. Good point, friend. This is what God's still asking them, bring those offerings and sacrifices. Okay, then you're going to jump all the way to First Chronicles 11, 1 to 9. Yeah, you wouldn't want to try to grab everything out of here. What's the part that really relates, or if somebody want to give us a summary or whatever you've got in your notes, we'll talk about it from there. I cannot see today. My hair is in my face. Okay. What have we got?
David was made king over all Israel.
Yeah.
And the city of David, Zion, is Jerusalem.
Good.
And they have to take that. They have to take
Okay.
it. It will
Okay. They have to take it
from the Jebusites.
from the Jebusites, right? And that's a name we'll watch for later. Was David supposed to take this away? How do we know that for sure from this passage? Anybody note that?
I didn't write it down, but I'm thinking God told him to.
He told him to. And the last verse that we had was verse 9. It said, David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of armies, was with him after he did what God asked him to do. Okay. So I know there are spots for certain people, especially if you don't know the God of the Old Testament, where you think, oh, well, he shouldn't have done that. But we'll look at the history of this and see what's actually happening. Again, we're in First Chronicles. Is this their first visit to the land for David? No. So is he taking the land, or is he taking it back?
Take it back.
He's taking it back. Okay. Okay, how about Psalm 132, 13 and 14?
Oh.
The Lord chose Zion for his resting place forever.
Okay, good. And I think when somebody was laying out the last part, they said this, but where is Zion?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. So God says, this is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will dwell. Okay, now we know in Jerusalem, and not just at some random place. We saw it with David. We see it here. We're still watching this history of his people. The reason your homework started here instead of back at the beginning of Canaan, which we'll go to next, is because the homework or the scripture starts with Jerusalem, right? Because God's talking to Jerusalem. So that's why we started here, and we'll actually backtrack a little bit. Okay, and then you had kind of a lengthy passage in Second Chronicles 6. We had verses 1 through 11. These are great reminders of Israel's history when you go to Kings and Chronicles. What did we learn in Second Chronicles 6?
Big thing is that God chooses.
Okay.
God chose Jerusalem, God chose David, and then God chose Solomon.
Okay, good. Jocelyn, were you going to say anything different?
I was gonna also, I say that in the temple, they placed the ark, which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with the people of Israel.
Right. This passage is taking place at what time? What has Solomon just completed?
Temple.
The
Temple.
temple. So this is where he has just completed it, and now this is the word about God living here and dwelling specifically in Jerusalem, and how he chose leadership and all of those things. Okay, good. Okay, that's one more set. Now you have one more set before we move on. And this set takes us back again to those first origins that we were talking about. So we're going to go back further in time than the verses that we were just in. So this is under number 5, looking at the land again. And so we're going to go back to Genesis 10, and you had verses 15 and 16. We're going to back up a little bit too, but what do you learn in verses 15 and 16?
Canaan fathered, is it Sidon or Sidon? I don't know how to say that. And Heth and the Jebusite.
Okay, and the
Amorites.
Amorite, which is one of the words that we
Yes.
have. Okay, so you're probably going, okay, well, that's great. But now we know that besides being a land, what else is Canaan?
A person.
He's a person. So let's go find out who this is. We're going to still be in Genesis 10, so you're going to need to open there. As soon as you can, if somebody sees in verse 6, we're going to look for, well, who is Canaan? And I think verse 6 is what will tell you who Canaan is.
Son of Ham.
Okay, son of Ham.
And
Now,
Ham is the son of Noah.
thank
Mhm.
you. So Deanna went back to verse 1, which says that Ham is the son of Noah. So we have Noah to Ham to Canaan. Canaan is the land God sends Abram to. This is one of those moments I had this week where I had another one of the like slap myself in the forehead moments. Because any land, especially the land here we see of Canaan, where God would send Abram and say, I'm going to give you this land, even though there's already people living there. How did the people living there get there? Who do they belong to? Who does Canaan belong to?
God, well, through
God.
Noah. Yeah.
God through Noah, right? So this was my reminder of the things that we have biblical knowledge about, but then sometimes they don't kind of go all the way through. And when they do, at least for me, I have this moment of reason and logic that comes through. So remember Noah? Why do we know about Noah? And we had this passage already, right? How do we have Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which were his 3 sons? Well, we just learned this. We just studied it.
He was favored by God. He followed God. He's faithful to God.
And because of that, what happened?
he was saved.
Saved.
Brought,
He
Whoops.
built an ark
Yeah, he was saved when God destroyed the rest of the
of
world.
the world. Yeah.
So Noah, so Ham, who we're looking at as father of Canaan, would we have expected that at least for a while Ham was following God?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so did Shem,
Mhm.
so did Japheth for a while.
Mhm.
But by the
Mhm.
time we get to Canaan, have they stopped following God?
Mm.
Mhm.
How do I know that? If the land was still full of a whole bunch of people following God, would God have had to take Abram out of a land and send him somewhere to make a nation for himself?
No.
No. So it just sort of made me think today, it almost feels like we have maybe approached the same kind of time frame in which God destroyed the entire world once. But instead of doing that, he's going to form a nation for himself. But this is what hit me is they're all relatives. God is not sending Abram to go remove people that they're God's people and they're not very far removed from Noah, right? These are
Mhm.
people who we know, if you read scripture, were not following the Lord.
Mm.
And neither was the place where Abraham was, but God looked at Abraham and said, this is the man, and I'm going to take him and he's going to be obedient. So it really helped me. And I thought maybe it would help people, especially if they're newer to these events of the Old Testament, to see the connections and what God is really saying. Does that make sense to you guys? Does
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
yeah,
Another
Fran?
thing it does to me is like it provides a direct lineage or
Yes.
of rights to the land, you know.
That's right.
So
Mm.
it it makes them bona fide,
That's
you know,
right.
that they this was his land from the beginning, from Noah
That's
on.
right.
And so,
From the beginning, right? And he only got sent here because his cousins or whatever they were weren't following God anymore. Something I want to say, I don't think we'll have time probably to look at it, but if you use Bible Hub already, if you're in Genesis 10 or you're in Chronicles or you're in whatever, you can click on, when you're in Bible Hub, there's a little thing, it looks like the word Tim, but that's actually an abbreviation for timeline. If you click on that, you will get the year that all these events happened. It's pretty interesting how far back the land belonged to Abraham. I've got a few of them. If we have time later, I'll bring it up and show you. But it's so easy to find the time. If you're already in Bible Hub, so say that you're in Bible Hub and you're in Genesis 10. While you're in Genesis 10, in the row, I think right above the passage, there's some little blue abbreviations. One of them looks like Tim, but that's an abbreviation for timeline. And if you click on that, it'll show you the date, the year for everything that happens in that chapter that they have. It's really cool. You can go back to the beginning of Genesis all the way through. We have dates for these things. We have literal dates.
Where? Mm.
If you're in Bible Hub, yeah.
It's
Okay.
on the app or whatever. It's not in blue, it's in white. I
Okay.
didn't know those split across, so there's even
Okay.
more.
Yeah, and I don't ever do it on the app, so sorry. I'm always on my computer because I'm.
Oh, yeah, I see it.
Oh,
Okay.
yes,
So
I see it
anyway,
now.
okay, so keep that in mind. We'll talk about it a bit later. Okay, so let's move on. So this is God's first promise. Go to the land of Canaan. We already knew that. Now we see who Canaan was. And your next reference takes you to Genesis 15, verses 18 to 21. What did you see there?
I was talking to myself. More about the covenant with the land and all the descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the Euphrates. And then it says who occupied it. So some of those were the Hittites, Canaanites, and Jebusites.
Right, and the Amorites. So we see the three people mentioned in Ezekiel 16, verse 3, are all listed here as part of that land of Canaanite. and the Jebusites, which you'll see later in 16. So again, all this connection, they're in the land, God's listing them. This is where he's sending Abram. And again, as Sarah said, reminder of the covenant, and that included descendants and this land. Okay, good. And then we're going to jump to Exodus 3:8. What did you learn there?
When God took his people out of captivity in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
to a land flowing with milk and honey,
Mm-hmm.
to the place of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites,
Okay, okay.
etc., Jebusites, all those people, all those ites.
Again, God says, I've come down to deliver them. He's going to send them out of captivity from Egypt. He frees his people. Remember that. Good time of year to be thinking about that in advance. Then he names the land. But again, in Exodus, is this their first time going? No, he's sending them back to where they were before they went into Egypt. And everybody remembers, right? Why, how did they even end up in Egypt if they already had the land of Canaan?
The famine and the time
Famine.
of Joseph and
Yeah.
Famine. So Joseph goes, the family goes, and then they all grow and multiply in Egypt. But God says, I'm taking you back to this land. Okay.
Mhm.
So are we confirmed then that this allegory that God's talking about in Ezekiel 16 is his true picture of what happened with his people?
Mhm.
So far, yes, their origin story is the same as what you would find in the study. Okay, any questions before we move into the next segment? Which you guys did this part of your homework already. Well, you did the observation part. And then we're going to go through your homework together after we read verses 9 to 14. But any questions before we do that? Okay, so
Mary was asking about the location. She couldn't find a geographical location for all those places in Canaan. Mary, is that right, or did you figure that out? I thought I saw a map somewhere in my precept Bible, but now I can't find it now what I found earlier. But in the very, very back, if you have a precept Bible, the very, very back, page 2242, it shows the whole Canaan is actually almost the Gaza Strip
Yeah,
to
I just want
Egypt, from the border of Egypt on up along the coast. And all of those, the Archites, Amorites, Hittites, Hivites, Jebusites, all those guys are all in there, that area.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I went out while we were doing I was looking.
yeah.
Okay, so good,
Yeah.
good. So
Thank
living
you.
history right before us, right? Living history right in front of our eyes.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Boy.
so before we read 9 to 14, we are remembering that we saw the birth of the nation of Israel. They're abandoned. God had them live and grow and multiply, and then he took them as his own. And again, if you go into the Exodus story when they're at the base of Mount Sinai and he makes the covenant with them, that is a marriage picture. And so that's the same thing that he's saying. I took you as my people. Now, after verse 8, we're going to see what the rest of that picture looks like as we read verses 9 to 14. Who can I pick up? Sarah Chantry, can you read verses 9 to 14 for us? Thank you. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then I bathed you with water, washed off your blood from you, and anointed you with oil. I also clothed you with embroidered cloth and put sandals of porpoise skin on your feet. And I wrapped you with fine linen and covered you with silk. I adorned you with ornaments, put bracelets on your hands, and a necklace around your neck. I also put a ring in your nostril, earrings in your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head. Thus you were adorned with gold and silver, and your dress was of fine linen, silk and embroidered cloth. You ate fine flour, honey, and oil, so you were exceedingly beautiful and advanced to royalty. Then your fame went forth among the nations on account of your beauty, for it was perfect because of my splendor, which I bestowed on you, declares the Lord God.
Okay, so we're going to follow along with your homework. So we would be at number 6A. And in this segment then, what happens to Jerusalem and who makes it happen?
So God adorns her with these beautiful things, bracelets, the earrings, the fine embroidered cloth. It gives a picture of kind of like a bride-like picture. And God makes it happen.
Okay, so this is a place where I think for me, I wanted the full picture, right? So as you, and you can fill in your answers here as we go. I would go right back to the top. I want to see what all these eyes, whatever God did for them. So it starts with them what? What's the first thing he did?
Bathed.
Bathed,
you.
right? So you put that however you want in your notes, bathed, cleansed, whatever you want to put them. Bathe them, and in the same verse,
Anointed, sorry.
it's okay. I love it. Anointed them with oil. Okay. The next thing he did,
Clothe them.
clothe them with what kind of clothing? Just like, you know, fig leaves or something,
Embroidered.
right? Fine
Yeah.
cloth, right? Fine embroidered. So he used the word fine for the linen, covered them with silk, right? So clothe them with however you want to word that. Next.
Put sandals on their feet.
Okay, yep, the feet
Or
too.
maybe that's
Feet
part
is-
of the other.
It
I don't
is,
know.
it's part of the clothing, you're right. Sandals on the
Okay.
feet. Yep. Didn't
Gives
leave
them
them barefoot.
jewelry.
Then you get the adornment, right? He adorned them with jewels, right? Bracelets, a
Mhm.
necklace. Then what? You can summarize all these under
Ring.
adorned with jewels, but
A ring in their nose.
uh-huh. Yeah, so you don't have to list every one of those. You all do this differently. I just put adorned with jewels, and but it ended with what? What's the final part of the adornment?
Embroidered
Wow.
cloth.
Crown, right? A crown on their
Oh,
head.
crown.
Put a crown on your head. So he's going to give us the word for what this picture is, but you can see it. He puts a crown on their heads.
Mhm.
Then what does he do for them?
They got to eat fine flour, honey, and oil.
Yep. He gave it to them, right? You ate
Yes.
ate fine flour, honey. He doesn't say it here, but he will later.
Advanced to royalty.
Okay, they were exceedingly beautiful and advanced
Yes.
to royalty. So then the next thing that happens to them, the last thing that happens is what? Verse
Their fame
14.
goes everywhere.
So because of that beauty, their fame goes everywhere. And then he says the why, right? The for,
Yeah.
that we mark those things.
Perfect.
And why was it perfect?
Because of my splendor, God's splendor.
Okay, which I bestowed on you. Okay, good. So somewhere there in your notes, you want whatever type of list that you want about what he did for them. and then that it was God who did it. So that's what happened. And Sarah had told us that. What Sarah also said was that this is a picture of a bride getting ready. Do we know that for sure? Because, this is pretty adorned. We do get ready, especially on wedding days, but is this a true biblical picture? Does anybody know? Is that the picture we have in front of us?
Yeah.
Is there any other place we would have a similar picture?
Well, kind of patterns after Esther.
Esther, yes. Yes, there's some little verses you can go to, like I think there's something in Psalms, but Esther and the harem and the women being ready, made ready for the king when he chooses one. Remember that? There's like years of preparation, and it's this similar picture. There's bathing and perfuming and jewels and made as beautiful as possible. But none of those women would have ever been as beautiful as the nation of Israel was to God, the way that he made them. Okay, so that sounds so good, right? Up to verse 14, this is a great chapter, so much nicer than some of the chapters we've had. Unfortunately, we have to keep going. So we're going to look now at verses 15 to 22. If you, I didn't assign you the observation, so I'm going to assume that most of you need to do it here, and that's what we're going to do. I'll read verses 15 to 22. You should already have God marked because we did that the last week, or the first week we did chapter 16, which I think wasn't last week, but the week before maybe. I don't even remember. We went all the way through and marked references to God. So if anybody hasn't done the marking, what would you mark first now? If you already have God marked, as I read it, what would you want to mark in verses 15 to 22 on this first reading?
What?
Harlot.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
I said harlot.
You will end up marking that, but first on the first read through, what are you going to be looking for?
God.
After God, because we already marked God.
Jerusalem or Israel.
Yes, the yous, right? We're always going to look for people first. And we've had a pattern in this chapter of God, and then we have a bunch of yous. And that's how you're going to mark. And Laura told us that we've been marking them as Jerusalem or Israel, however you want to mark them. So if you haven't done that yet, that would be where I would start for verses 15 to 22. And I don't know, is there somebody else who doesn't mind reading while they mark or has it read? I don't want anybody to have to read if they're trying to mark too, because there's a lot of marking.
Read.
Okay, so Jocelyn's
can
going
read
to read
too.
15 to 22 for us.
But you trusted in your beauty and played the harlot because of your fame, and you poured out your harlotries on every passerby who might be willing. You took some of your clothes made for yourself. You took some of your clothes, made for yourself high places of various colors, and played the harlot on them, which should never come about nor happen. You also took your beautiful jewels made of my gold and of my silver, which I had given you, and made for yourself male images that you might play the harlot with them. Then you took your embroidered cloth and covered them and offered my oil and my incense before them. Also my bread, which I gave you, fine flour, oil, and honey, with which I fed you. You would offer before them for a soothing aroma. So it happened, declares the Lord God. Moreover, you took your sons and daughters, whom you had borne to me, and sacrificed them to idols to be devoured. Were your harlotries so small a matter? You slaughtered my children and offered them up to idols by causing them to pass through the fire.
One more.
I gotta get my sheet.
Okay.
Besides all your abominations and harlotries, You did not remember the days of your youth, when you were naked and bare and squirming in your blood.
Okay, so now we've looked at the people, and normally we've also been marking Ezekiel, but in this segment we've got God and his people, his bride that he just made. So that's who we're marking. But what we're going to do now then is continue your observation, and after we look at people, then we look for the what, which is the subject or the topic or the key word. So if God is speaking to people, then he's usually speaking to them about something. So we're just going to start. We've got sets of words we've been looking at, and we've got some words that will very quickly become obvious that they are keywords. So if you look back at verse 15, Evelyn already mentioned this word. What do we need to go through and mark?
Harlotries.
Harlot and harlotries, and you would just use the same marking for both of them. So you can mark as we go, but if we just kind of help each other out by saying, you know, what verse they're in, what's the first place that you see harlot?
15, 16, 17.
Yeah, so it becomes quick. So in 15, you've got
20.
harlot and harlotries, right? You poured them out. 16, you guys see that? You played the harlot on them.
Mhm.
17, you might play the harlot with them.
20.
Verse 20, were your harlotries so small a matter? And
22.
22, besides all your abominations and harlotries. While you're there, what else do you want to mark right there?
Abominations.
Abomination.
Abominations.
And oh,
Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
and blood.
And blood, if you want to, that's another one we've been marking. If you want to mark that while you're there, you could go ahead and do that. In fact, there's one other thing you want to mark in verse 22.
Okay.
The days of your youth. There's a time reference, and that one's important because it takes us right back to the beginning, right?
Yes.
You see God tying this in again. Okay, so let's go back another time. You might have noticed while you were looking at harlotries that there's a repeated word connected to their harlotries. That's what the harlotry is about. What is that? There's a
Made.
Instead of made, I would mark the thing they're making.
Idols.
Idols and images, right?
Images.
So if you start in verse, where's the first one?
20.
Oh,
20.
before that, way
Is it
back.
15.
Made for yourself high places.
Yeah, well,
Oh.
that's up to you. If you're marking high places, you could mark it the same. You could mark high places. But then when did they start making the images?
Oh, 17.
17. So
Ah.
you made male images, but then there's also a pronoun if you want to mark that as well. You might play the harlot with them. Okay. Then where's the next place? We're going to continue with the same pronoun in the next verse, right?
Mm-hmm.
You covered them and offered my oil and my incense before them.
Yeah.
How about 19?
Yeah. You would offer before them.
Yes, you would offer before them. Now watch, the thems are going to change in a minute, but that one is still referring to the idols. Okay, what happens in verse 20?
Idols.
Yeah.
Sacrifice them. It's being sons and daughters to
Yeah,
idols.
that them is sons and
Them
daughters, but
sons
you
and
do want to
daughters.
mark idols. You do want to mark idols. Okay,
And then
what
21.
and 21. You offered
Mark
them up
fire
to
in
idols.
21.
Yes, you can mark fire. I always mark fire. You can mark
I did
fire
that
if you
too.
want. Again, everybody has sort of a difference in how much they want to have on here. Did anybody see anything else that they wanted? I think I have covered most of what I marked, but does anybody have a question or mark something different? There's
Maybe,
one.
well, we're going to cover it anyway, but it's just so obvious that things are being sacrificed to idols and God gave all the good things that are being sacrificed.
Yes, that is something that we would want to talk about as we discuss these verses before we go into the cross references, because they don't really ask you any of those questions. But yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. And that's going to lead us to, there's one more thing I'm going to make sure that we mark. This passage starts with what word?
But
But. But starts with
Hmm.
but. So we had verses 9 to 14, which were full of the beauty that God has bestowed on his people as he made them his. And we were happy to just stop there, right? And then verse 15 starts with but. Those of us who've been marking these words for a while, what does that indicate to us, the word but?
A contrast.
A contrast. So there's
Contrast.
going to be a contrast between something we were just told and something we're about to be told. So if you look at your homework, if you're new to this marking, I use a red backslash right before the word. So if you're watching, or even if you're here and you haven't done that before, I use a red backslash, but you could use whatever you want there. So your homework addresses this in the workbook. So let's look at 6B on page 57. It's where we just were. It says Ezekiel 16:15 to 22 starts with but, a term that many times introduces a contrast. So what is the contrast? What are we contrasting here? Whatever you want to put in your answer.
I just said royalty. God's people became harlots, no longer royalty.
And they
Okay,
trusted in their
all right.
beauty.
They trusted in their beauty. Fran, were you going to say something, or?
Just the contrast is God gave Israel every splendor to make her perfect, but she misused the God's gifts and was unfaithful.
Okay, good. And that addresses too the way Janelle was starting to remind us that everything, that's why it's important to look at all those I did, I gave to you, and then read again those sections of what they used when they made their idols. So yeah, anybody else have a question or a thought about how you might summarize what the contrast is for you?
I said because they trusted in their beauty instead of trusting in God.
Okay.
So I got more to the trust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and also if you think about it, I think the vanity of their own appearance caused them to be in a certain form looking down, right? Looking at themselves, looking at their own glory and crediting themselves. And so they literally forgot God.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you want to make sure, and you don't have to, however you write this is fine. But remember, as we look at verse 8, starting at 8 through 14, what's our clear picture that we have? What is the picture, the allegory God is telling us? God has made Israel his what?
Bride.
His bride. So remember back to the end of chapter 15, and we started marking unfaithfulness, and they said, mark it the same way you're going to mark harlot. God uses the word unfaithful very specifically. So in verses 8 to 14, he has made them his bride. And verses 15 on, what have they done?
Adultery.
Adultery, harlotry. They are cheating on God. They are an unfaithful spouse. So the picture is all of the splendor and beauty that he gave them, then they turned and gave. They didn't just give it away. I think we have to, whatever we write, you also in your mind though want to make sure we understand the strength of what God is saying here. He gave them all their beauty, and what did they do with it? What did they do with every one of those things we listed? What did they do with it?
They gave it away
To what?
to their enemies.
No,
Sin.
Other
sometimes
gods.
to
Idol
other
worship.
gods, to other
Oh,
gods.
sure.
They made it into their idols. He gave them, let's look at some of it. The first one, you played the harlot because of your fame, right? Somebody mentioned that. They got so famous that again, the pride was there. But then how did they make high places in verse 16? What did they make them from?
Clothes that God
Their
gave.
clothes. Who gave them those fine clothes? God. God did. We saw the verse. What did they make some male images out of?
The jewels.
The
The
jewels
gold,
and the gold and
silver.
silver that he gave them. The embroidered cloth, what did they do with it? They covered them. What did they do with the food he gave them?
He offered it to the idols.
They
The
offered it to
soothing
idols.
aroma.
And then their own children, what did they do?
They
Sacrifice.
offered them
They
on fire.
sacrificed them to idols. Now, two questions. We may not know this, you might know it. Is that literal in verse 22? Did they actually sacrifice their sons and daughters? They did.
So-
It is literal, but could this also be a spiritual and a bigger picture as well? For me, and again, they did this. We don't want to decrease that picture at all because they did it literally. But also when he says, your sons and daughters whom you had born to me, what picture does that give you? You sacrificed your children, your spiritual children, or the children that you had with
Right.
God. What picture is that?
He gave them.
To me, you didn't bring them up to worship God or in the
Yeah.
church.
Right,
And you gave them plenty of things.
right. So beyond their physical sons and daughters, if this is the children born between God and the nation of Israel, who are those children?
God's.
God's children, but it's the continuation of the nation,
The
right?
nation, yeah.
You continued this. So you leaders and prophets and priests that we've been looking at who didn't give your people the right spiritual path, those are my children, God says, and you sacrifice them, right? This picture of you let them go astray. You sacrificed them. You gave them away. To me, it was both. They definitely did do this literally. And but I was just reminded of maybe a bigger spiritual picture there too. Okay, and what's the last thing that he says that they did besides all your abominations and harlotries? It's almost like this is even more important to him, if that could be possible. What's the other thing?
Remember the days of their youth?
They didn't remember that God saved them.
That's right. They didn't remember that God was the one who rescued them when they were a first beginning nation and nobody cared, nobody helped them. They were literally, it sounds like, about to die, and God made them live. And they have forgotten that. They've forgotten who they were. They've forgotten who God is. And he says, above all else, you did that. Okay,
Yeah.
before we go, I'll go ahead. Yep.
I was just gonna say, God is so big on us remembering him, because when we remember him, we are spurred on to repent. So it's not necessarily that about the sin or that he can't cover it. It's about us returning to him. And when we forget him, we're still lost in our pride.
Great point, Sarah. Keep reminding us what it is God is always wanting from the people. And this is something that you will find God speaking of repeatedly with his people. You didn't remember. You don't remember. And again, with us, did Jesus call us to remember him? He said, do this so that you remember me, these things. I want you to remember. I want you to remember. I think we could fall easily into the same pattern of not remembering, and I always think back to our study in John, for me, I walked away from that study with this phrase in my mind. Jesus had made it so simple as we looked at him. When he came up to somebody, he would tell them who they were, he would tell them who he was, and then say that if you follow him, you could be his and you could be like him instead. I got that picture from, especially from the woman at the well. But then as you look at every encounter, it was the same thing, whether it was the paralytic or somebody else. That's all he did, was he tells us who we are and tells us who he is and who we can be in him instead. And we have to remember that too. Like Sarah said, we have to remember he's God and who we are without him. And they forgot who they were without God. But unfortunately, they find out what happens when they choose to walk without him. Okay, any other thoughts or questions on those verses themselves before we go ahead and do the next set of cross references so that we can look to see, well, what part of history then, of their history, does this relate to? If we know that their origin related, what does this refer to? But any other questions or impacts just from the verses? Okay, well, let's go.
I
Oh,
got
go ahead,
this,
Fran.
the word, he's our deliverer, and then it just kind of dawned on me, this word throughout the Bible it references how God pulled us up out of that bloody mess that is described there, just like, and not a bloody mess, sometimes it's a delivery,
Yeah.
delivered
Right.
as babes,
Yeah.
and so how unthankful we are as his children to walk away from him and to not appreciate all the gifts that we've been given.
Yeah.
And we're all guilty of that. I
Yeah,
mean, I know
we are.
that
Yeah.
whole feeling of, you forget that so much in
Yeah.
your life, but God, the deliverer, he delivered his people from Egypt. He delivered them into the promised land, and throughout time, all through that timetable that you're talking about, it's
Yeah.
shown again and again, and he's promised us to have that, to take care of us, but we keep screwing up.
Yeah. And that is that reminder why the word covenant is so important, because this goes to something that's being really, it's dividing the world right now, dividing the church right now. Is God faithful to his promises even when his people aren't?
Yes.
Is he?
Yes.
Yes. That's what covenant says. Covenant is not a contract, and we mess it up all the time. As believers, we should make covenants with people and keep them the same way. But for God, God says he cannot break his covenant. He can't. So once you understand that, you know that whatever promises are in God's word, he's always going to keep them to you. Even if you're unfaithful, he remains faithful, right? And that's part of this picture.
But we just let him down,
We just let him down.
that we just let, and that, this just brings how his heart is broken about this unfaithfulness that we.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. So yeah, let's go ahead and look at where this happened in their history, because we know he planted them in a land of milk and honey, and he's redeemed them from Egypt, and they're back in that land. But we're going to progress up. Your first passage they give you is really long. We're going to divide this up as we read it. They say to do a quick reading, which we aren't going to dig deep, but we do want to pause so we can just grab the details. So we're at letter C, number 1. And if you guys would turn to 2 Chronicles 8, and I'll have a first reader. And actually, you guys keep flipping directions on me. Fran, could you read 2 Chronicles 8, just 16 to 18, and then we'll stop, grab a point or two, and then we'll move on.
Okay.
Everybody needs 2 Chronicles 8, 16 to 18.
Okay. 2 Chronicles 8.
not see.
Oh, I found the map. Oh. Second Chronicles 8, 16 to what now?
18. I think it's the
Okay.
end actually, but yeah.
16 to 18, okay. Thus all the work of Solomon was carried out from the day of the foundation of the house of the Lord and until it was finished. So the house of the Lord was completed. Then Solomon went to Leon, and to Elah on the seashore in the land of Edom. And Huram by his servants sent him ships and servants who knew the sea, and they went with Solomon's servants to Ophir and took it from there 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon. Now when the queen
that's it for now.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
I want to stop. So if you're going to grab something from there that's going to help us understand, remember, these are going to relate back to not just segment 15 to 22, but from 10 on, right? So they're telling us that what we're going to read is going to help us understand God's connection beginning in verse 10, right? And 10 to 14, that's when he was giving them all the fame and beauty. So far, what do you see here that's interesting for where we're looking?
Of the temple.
Solomon just completed the temple, and it looks like there's a bunch of money, right? We'll keep on with that. But Solomon's completed the temple, if you want to note from that part. Okay, then Second Chronicles 9 is where we go. And Dee Dee, could you read verses 1 to 12, and then we'll stop again. So again, just watch for what you think we're trying to understand that connects here. A good
Chronicles
story.
9. Now then the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, so she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with difficult questions. And she had a large retinue with camels carrying spices and a large amount of gold and precious stones. And she came to Solomon. She spoke with him about all that was on her heart. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from Solomon which she did not explain to her. Then the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house which he had built, the food at his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his ministers and their attire, his cupbearers and their attire, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. She was breathless. Then she said to the king, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe their reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, half of the greatness of your wisdom was not told to me. You surpassed the report that I heard. How blessed are your men, how blessed are your servants who stand by you continually and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you, setting you on his throne as king for the Lord your God. Because your God loved Israel, establishing them forever, therefore he made you king over them to do justice and righteousness. Then she gave the king 150 talents of gold, a very great amount of spices and precious stones. There had never been a spice like that which the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. How far?
To 12, through 12.
To 12. Then the servants of Huram and the servants of Solomon, who brought gold from Ophir, also brought algum trees and precious stones. From the algum trees, the king made the steps for the house of the Lord and for the king's palace, and lyres and harps for the singers, and none like that had been seen before in the land of Judah. King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all her desire which she requested, besides for a return for that which she brought to the king. And then she turned and went to her own land with her servants.
Okay, why are we here? Why are we in this passage?
God's made incredible provision for Solomon and his kingdom.
Okay.
For one thing.
Provision's a good word.
Yeah.
Look for the words that might be the same as the words as we have in Ezekiel 16.
Wonder.
I guess maybe the word is not here, but the idea.
Well, the one in verse 6, in what I'm reading, it
Yes.
said you exceed the fame which I
Yes.
heard.
That's
And-
it. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
No, I mean, when I read that, I know Dee Dee's was a different translation, but I thought, oh my goodness, that's the same word. I mean,
Yeah, so some of us have the word reports, but what is the basis of this story? Who is it that has come to Solomon?
The Queen of Sheba,
And why did she come?
because she heard about Solomon's fame.
She
But she
heard
also
about,
says
go ahead.
Solomon's fame, but she knows that it came from God.
Yes, we'll get to that part in a minute. So
It just like struck me. Boom.
yeah, I heard it when you were reading. I could tell that it did. So verse 14 in Ezekiel 16 said, your fame went forth among the nations on account of your beauty. Now, according to Sheba, the Queen of Sheba, that's not her name, actually. They don't know her name. It is just Queen of Sheba. How famous is he? Like, what did she experience when she saw the wealth that he actually has? Did anybody catch that?
Was overwhelmed.
She was overwhelmed. She was breathless, right? Mine says she was breathless.
Breathless.
She said,
yeah.
I heard this report, but I didn't expect it to be true. It wasn't exactly true. Why wasn't it exactly true? Had they underrepresented his wealth or
Yes,
no,
it
they
was
had
greater
under,
than she had heard.
right? She said it wasn't even half your riches and your wisdom. So did God bring his people up to the level of what he's telling Ezekiel that he did? Yes,
Yeah.
we're going to see more in a minute, but let's talk about what Dee Dee said, because this actually is not a question you have. However, it is a prophecy and a promise we have been looking at from the beginning of this study. What has God always told his people, them and us, will happen if you are being the people he's called you to be? This isn't here, but it's a thing we've been looking at all the way through.
And give you the desires of your heart.
Be
Yes,
blessed.
prosperous.
yes,
Blessed.
yes.
Greatness.
Okay, remember the unfruitful vine that he got rid of? Remember the idea of being watchmen? What is the purpose of God picking a nation and blessing them? Is it just for them?
So others will see.
So others will see, right? So like every time we have ever seen, I am doing this for you that they may know that I am the
I'm
Lord.
God.
Does that, according to 2 Chronicles 9, does that actually work when people do it? Yes, because again, let's look at the verse that Dee Dee's talking about. The Queen of Sheba, who is not a God follower, right? She said what in verse 8? Dee Dee, you want to just read verse 8 again?
Yep. Oops, I just lost it on my, blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you, setting you on his throne as king for the Lord your God, because your God loved Israel, establishing them forever. Therefore, he made you king over them to do justice and righteousness.
Okay, so a queen from another nation, which by the way, I was going to bring up the map, but it's actually on that map we've been talking about that you have. You can see where Sheba is. It's down where what is now Yemen. It's about almost 1,300 miles from Israel. The Queen of Sheba, who was wealthy and famous in her own right, came 1,300 miles to meet Solomon because she'd heard such astounding reports of his riches and wisdom. And when she got there, it was not even half. She had only not even heard half of how great it was. And then she gives credit to whom?
To God.
To God, our God, their God. She calls him your God, the God of Israel. And why? He says, because God loved Israel, establishing them forever. So a queen from another nation has just told Solomon that his wealth and riches and wisdom is evidence that God loves Israel and is going to establish them forever. That's pretty astounding, don't you think?
Mhm. But it does say at the end of the verse that he has a responsibility too. He made you king over them to do justice and righteousness.
Yes, she can see that, and we know some of those stories, right? He made very wise
But
decisions
yeah, for a
until
while.
for a while. So now what we need to do, so somewhere in your notes, that's just what you want to see, something about the Queen of Sheba recognized the great fame. And so that would connect to those verses up to 14. Okay, now we need to finish this. Well, it doesn't finish chapter 9, but we're going to read 13 to 24 to continue what the homework wanted us to look at. Where am I? Cheryl, can you read that for us? 2 Chronicles 9, 13 to 14.
13 to 14, yeah.
Yep.
The weight of the gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold, besides what the traveling merchants and traders brought. And all the kings of Arabia and governors of the country brought gold and silver to Solomon. You said to 14?
All the way to 24.
Oh, okay. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of hammered gold went into each shield. He also made 300 shields of hammered gold. 300 shekels of gold went into each shield. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps with a footstool of gold, which were fastened to the throne. There were armrests on either side of the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the armrests. 12 lions stood there, 1 on each side of the 6 steps. Nothing like this had been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the merchants came, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, and all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules at a set rate year by year.
Okay, so how wealthy is the nation of Israel at this point? That's the picture, right? Very wealthy. We really only needed the one verse down near the bottom. What's the summary here? What are we supposed to know from this passage? How great is the nation of Israel and the king of Israel?
Verse 23.
Yep.
Greater
Nothing.
than all the kings of the earth.
So greater than all the kings of the earth in what? Just wealth?
Riches and wisdom.
And then, so because of that, what did all the kings of the earth do?
Brought in presents.
They brought in presents and they came to hear the wisdom which God had put in his heart. So that's the level of fame that they have reached. And that's what God's talking about in verse 14 of Ezekiel chapter 16. Oh, we had just one more passage that I wanted us to do, but it's long. So I'll give you one extra assignment for homework. So, okay, if you're watching, well, I'll do this now. We'll do it on here. So have a look at your homework for a minute. This seems like a weird place to cut off, but the rest of the picture, because this covered up to verse 14. Now we need to look and see, well, what happened? This sounds great. So you need number 2 on page 58, the top, the little 2. You're going to look at 1 Kings 11, 1 to 13. And that's going to tell us where's the part that covers 15 to 22, what happens to them. So that's the verse that's going to give us that. And then verse 4, or letter D, I'm sorry. That's an application kind of question, but it does reference a verse further back in Ezekiel. So answer that question. And then you're going to continue. The first thing you'll want to do after you do those two, before you do number 7, you'll need to finish all your observation. Okay. At that point, you might as well finish the rest of it because they're going to take things in bigger chunks than just segments. So complete your observation. You could write that by number 7. Then you want to do number 7, which continues into page 59. And you also want to do number 8, which is page 60, and up at the top of page 61, letter C. Stop before number 9, and we'll start with number 9 together. Okay? It's not all cross references, so it shouldn't be quite as lengthy as some of it. But again, you're used to doing more homework than that anyway. Well, not this year, you're not used to it, but you're used to it before. Okay, does that make sense? Your homework just goes over to page 60, letter C. Just start where we are and go there and finish your observation. Okay, and then we'll pick it up from there. So I'm going to let the recording stop so that those of you watching can end this and do something else.